Today is Monday, June 15th, 2026. In the early hours of this morning, radar systems across the Persian Gulf lit up with unexpected activity as commercial vessels that had been held at anchor for weeks suddenly began maneuvering toward the narrow choke point of the Strait of Hormuz under orders tied directly to a developing agreement between the United States and Iran. What had been a tense naval blockade enforced by American forces during Operation Epic Fury was now easing as President Trump directed the end of the restrictive measures, allowing critical energy shipments to resume flow through the vital waterway. This shift did not emerge from nowhere, but followed intense back-channel negotiations where Iranian officials signaled willingness to accept verification protocols on their nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief structured on performance benchmarks. Defense analysts monitoring satellite feeds watched closely as Arleigh Burke-class destroyers adjusted positions away from primary tanker routes, while Iranian naval patrols reduced aggressive shadowing operations that had previously threatened to close the 22nd Year Times.
The tension between Iran and America is reaching a whole new level, and the world is divided. But the real question is, who do you stand with? America has official live voting open right now to see where the public support lies. If you love America and want to show your support, go to the description or the pinned comment right now. If you are using an Android, click the Android link, and if you are on an iPhone, click the iOS link. Just complete the quick 1-minute verification to make your vote count officially, and let's show the strength of America. Go vote now.
Straight entirely. The implications rippled outward immediately because roughly 20% of global oil and significant liquefied natural gas volumes depend on safe passage here, and any prolonged disruption had already strained European energy markets and Asian importers who faced higher spot prices and rerouted shipping that added days to transit times. As commercial satellite imagery confirmed the first tankers entering the strait, without incident questions mounted about how durable this pause would prove, given the recent history of missile exchanges and proxy conflicts that had defined the past months. The deal outlined key concessions, including the dismantling or dilution of Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpiles under IAEA oversight and the destruction of advanced centrifuge facilities that could have accelerated a path toward weapons-grade material. Yet private assessments from regional intelligence sources suggested that Iranian military commanders remained wary of appearing too compliant domestically, where economic hardships from sanctions and internal protests had already fueled street demonstrations met with force earlier in the year. Energy markets reacted with a measured decline in crude futures, but underlying volatility persisted because insurers had grown hesitant to cover Gulf transits fully after repeated Houthi and IRGC-linked threats. This reopening carried strategic weight far beyond the immediate maritime lanes since it connected directly to broader efforts to stabilize the Middle East, allowing Qatar's LNG exports to reach European terminals more reliably and easing pressure on global supply chains that had indirectly impacted military logistics for operations elsewhere. And if you are finding value in this detailed daily breakdown, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more unfiltered geopolitical intelligence that cuts through the noise. What complicated the picture further was the lingering presence of U.S. forces at bases in Qatar and elsewhere in the region, which Iranian negotiators had sought to reduce but ultimately failed to secure in the agreement. Over-the-horizon capabilities remained intact, meaning American assets could respond rapidly if verification faltered or if threats re-emerged from Iranian proxies. In southern Lebanon, recent exchanges between Israeli forces and Hezbollah positions had nearly derailed the talks until direct intervention from President Trump urged restraint on both sides to preserve the larger diplomatic opening. Satellite observations revealed Israeli Iron Dome batteries on heightened alert, while Hezbollah strongholds in Beirut suburbs showed signs of repositioned rocket systems, but no immediate barrage followed the latest tit-for-tat strike. This interconnected tension highlighted how a single miscalculation in one theater could cascade into the Gulf, where naval assets from multiple nations continued electronic warfare monitoring to detect any sudden drone swarm or missile launch that might target shipping. The destruction inflicted during Operation Epic Fury had significantly degraded Iran's ballistic missile production lines and naval assets, leaving the regime with fewer options for direct confrontation, but also deeper incentives to test the boundaries of the New Deal through indirect means. Military planners in Washington and Tel Aviv focused on verification mechanisms that would require not only U.S. intelligence, but independent IAEA access to underground facilities where enriched material had been stored. Estimates suggested Iran had approached thresholds sufficient for multiple devices before the operation forced negotiations, yet the agreement demanded export dilution or destruction of those stocks under monitored conditions. Economic consequences were already visible as Iranian officials began framing the outcome domestically as a victory of resilience while preparing propaganda that emphasized military power as the factor compelling American flexibility. In reality, the regime faced severe internal pressures, including water shortages in Tehran and unpaid military salaries that had eroded cohesion and made sanctions relief an urgent necessity. Commercial shipping data indicated a gradual resumption of traffic with tankers from Saudi and Emirati terminals adjusting courses toward the reopened strait, yet the psychological shadow of recent attacks kept insurance premiums elevated and rerouting options active for risk-averse operators. This dynamic fed into larger alliance calculations, where Gulf states weighed deeper normalization with Israel under the Abraham Accords framework against residual Iranian threats. During the height of Epic Fury, joint air defense efforts involving Patriot systems, American Aegis-equipped vessels, and Israeli aero batteries had demonstrated effective coordination against incoming projectiles, revealing vulnerabilities in Iran's proxy networks that had been systematically targeted. The deal did not resolve those underlying proxy relationships with groups like the Houthis, who retained capacity to disrupt Red Sea shipping through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, potentially as leverage if Tehran perceived the agreement tilting too far against its interests. What emerged as a critical unknown was the extent to which Iran could or would restrain these networks while rebuilding after substantial losses to its drone and missile infrastructure. Intelligence updates pointed to selective leaks from within Iranian circles aimed at shaping narratives around the deal's implementation, even as U.S. officials stressed its contingent nature, meaning sanctions relief would phase in only upon verified compliance. Markets had anticipated this reopening, but the speed of Trump's directive caught some analysts off guard, prompting short-term adjustments in oil benchmarks that reflected cautious optimism. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, parallel developments in Russian supply lines and European energy diversification efforts gained new relevance, because stable Gulf flows reduced immediate urgency for alternative sources but did not eliminate long-term exposure to geopolitical shocks. The situation in the South China Sea remained monitored, with U.S. Navy presence maintaining freedom of navigation patrols amid Chinese assertions, yet the Hormuz breakthrough offered a momentary case study in calibrated pressure yielding diplomatic results. And if you are finding value in this detailed daily breakdown, make sure to subscribe to the channel for continuing coverage of these high-stakes shifts reshaping global power balances. Hidden beneath the surface of official statements lay institutional fears in multiple capitals about accidental escalation, where overloaded radar systems or misidentified contacts could trigger unintended responses in crowded waters. Virginia-class submarines continued discreet operations in the broader Indian Ocean, providing strategic depth, while surface fleets focused on deconfliction protocols, with Iranian vessels now operating under new rules of engagement tied to the agreement. The timing of the deal coincided with domestic political considerations in the United States as the nation approached its 250th anniversary celebrations, creating pressure to demonstrate tangible foreign policy wins that allowed redeployment of forces and reduced operational costs. For Israel, the population that had endured repeated shelter alerts and proxy attacks viewed the arrangement with guarded pragmatism, demanding ironclad verification to prevent any resurgence of nuclear pathways that Iranian leadership had publicly vowed to pursue against the Jewish state. Recent strikes in southern Beirut targeting Hezbollah commanders illustrated the fragility where one rocket barrage could prompt Israeli retaliation, potentially drawing Iranian responses that tested the nascent Hormuz understanding. President Trump's personal calls to restrain both sides underscored the delicate diplomacy required to keep momentum alive toward a signing ceremony planned for later in the week in Geneva. This episode revealed contradictions in public posturing versus private calculations, as Iranian deputy foreign ministers highlighted military threats as having influenced the text, while U.S. briefings emphasized American objectives fully met, including no withdrawal from regional bases and maintenance of over-the-horizon strike options. Economic fallout from prior disruptions had already reshaped trade patterns, with Asian buyers securing longer-term contracts outside traditional Gulf routes, and European nations accelerating renewable transitions to mitigate future risks. Yet the reopening promised short-term relief for global inflation pressures linked to energy costs that had compounded challenges in post-conflict reconstruction zones. Satellite imagery shared through open-source channels showed cleared mine threats along key approaches and reduced electronic jamming activity, which had previously interfered with commercial navigation signals. These tactical details painted a picture of controlled de-escalation rather than outright resolution, because underlying doctrinal commitments on both sides persisted, including Iran's support for asymmetric warfare through proxies and the U.S. commitment to partner defense architectures across the Gulf. In Moldova and other Eastern European flashpoints, Russian movements continued to draw attention, as energy stability in the Middle East indirectly influenced NATO resource allocation and sanction enforcement strategies. The broad system of global conflicts felt increasingly linked, where Hormuz flows affected Ukraine aid sustainability by stabilizing allied economies, and where Taiwan tensions influenced U.S. carrier deployments that could not be fully diverted despite Gulf priorities. Military intelligence assessments stressed that Iran's weakened navy, after targeted strikes during Epic Fury, limited its ability to enforce tolls or blockades unilaterally, yet the regime retained Shahed drone networks capable of swarming operations if political will shifted. This vulnerability exposed a core tension in the agreement, because performance-based sanctions relief required sustained Iranian restraint that domestic hardliners might challenge through provocative actions. Commanders in the Pentagon and Central Command reviewed contingency plans for rapid reimposition of measures if verification stalled, noting that Fifth Fleet assets remained positioned for swift response without needing full-scale mobilization. The psychological impact on markets was pronounced as traders weighed the possibility of renewed insurance pullouts against the prospect of normalized traffic volumes that could ease bottlenecks at ports worldwide. What terrified energy analysts was not merely a single incident, but the cumulative effect of uncertainty that could halt coverage for entire fleets operating in the region, forcing reroutes around Africa that added substantial costs and delays. Private fears within Gulf capitals centered on whether this deal represented a genuine pivot or merely a tactical pause, allowing Iran breathing room to reconstitute capabilities. Open-source analysts pored over imagery of damaged production facilities, confirming setbacks to ballistic programs that had once threatened targets as far as Turkey and beyond, yet acknowledging that knowledge transfer and underground facilities complicated full dismantlement. The narrative emerging from Tehran focused on survival and strategic patience, while Washington highlighted the deal as evidence of effective pressure yielding verifiable security gains. And if you are finding value in this detailed daily breakdown, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more insights into the hidden mechanics driving these international crises. As the day progressed, reports indicated initial tanker movements proceeding without interference, yet naval commanders maintained vigilance against potential cyber disruptions or sudden radio silences that could signal testing of new boundaries. The agreement's emphasis on nuclear verification involved multiple parties, including European stakeholders, invested in non-proliferation norms that aligned with efforts to prevent black market proliferation risks. In parallel, China's diplomatic overtures in the Middle East reflected its own energy security interests, prompting quiet assessments of how a stabilized Hormuz might alter Belt and Road dynamics and South China Sea posturing. These interconnections underscored the systemic nature of modern geopolitics, where a decision in the Gulf reverberated through supply chains feeding defense industries in Europe and Asia. Institutional psychology played a visible role, as officials avoided overly optimistic language, preferring measured statements that preserved flexibility for future adjustments. Selective leaks served to manage expectations both domestically and internationally, revealing calculated opacity in how details of centrifuge dismantlement and material dilution would be confirmed. Tactical movements of commercial shipping resumed alongside discreet military repositioning that avoided triumphalism but signaled sustained deterrence. The real danger lay in the potential for one overloaded radar contact or drone misidentification to unravel the fragile equilibrium, especially amid ongoing proxy frictions in Yemen and Lebanon. Israeli sources emphasized that while the deal offered a framework for de-escalation, the right to self-defense against imminent threats remained absolute, a position that could intersect with Iranian commitments in unpredictable ways. Logistics corridors through the strait began showing increased activity, with LNG carriers from Qatar adjusting schedules to capitalize on the opening, yet the lag in full implementation reminded observers that diplomatic agreements often require days or weeks for operational translation on the water. Economic figures from prior months illustrated the blockade's toll, with global oil prices spiking and alternative routes straining capacity at key terminals. This relief came at a moment when broader sanctions enforcement against other actors continued, highlighting selective application based on strategic priorities. The situation in Ukraine benefited indirectly, as stable energy prices supported European resolve while U.S. focus remained distributed across multiple theaters. Defense technology developments, including advanced Aegis upgrades and electronic warfare countermeasures, gained renewed relevance in this environment where hybrid threats blended kinetic and non-kinetic domains. Unanswered questions persisted around the depth of Iranian compliance and the durability of proxy restraint, particularly if internal regime pressures mounted from economic reconstruction demands. Satellite systems tracked movements of IRGC assets, noting reduced overt presence near chokepoints but persistent underground activity that warranted continued scrutiny. The deal's performance-based structure incentivized adherence by tying sanctions relief to milestones, yet past violations suggested that enforcement mechanisms would face immediate tests. Governments feared privately that public euphoria could mask residual capabilities, allowing gradual reconstitution if oversight wavered. This layered uncertainty sustained the sense of an evolving crisis where today's reopening represented progress but not closure. Military movements in the broader region reflected this reality, with U.S. forces maintaining posture at bases that Iranian negotiators had hoped to see diminished. The Fifth Fleet's continued operations provided reassurance to allies while signaling to Tehran the limits of concessions extracted. In the information warfare domain, both sides advanced selective narratives, with OSINT communities cross-referencing official claims against visible realities from commercial imagery and shipping data. These efforts exposed gaps between rhetoric and implementation that informed future risk assessments. Economic consequences extended to reconstruction priorities in Iran, where water infrastructure and military payrolls competed for limited resources post-deal. The interplay with China-Taiwan dynamics remained subtle, yet relevant, as naval assets balanced commitments across oceans, underscoring the finite nature of power projection. NATO strategies adapted to energy variables that influenced sustainment for eastern flank operations, where Russian advances continued to demand attention. This global web of tensions meant the Hormuz development, while significant, formed one node in a larger strategic system, where vulnerabilities in one area could amplify pressures elsewhere. As hours passed, initial reports confirmed smoother transit for early vessels, yet vigilance against mine detection failures or communication breakdowns persisted among operational planners. The institutional fear of uncontrolled escalation remained palpable because even limited incidents could trigger chain reactions involving multiple actors and domains. Short-term market reactions offered breathing room, but longer-term forecasting emphasized contingency planning for potential reversals. Open-source tracking of naval positioning and drone activities provided public insight into what governments monitored, discreetly revealing the extent of ongoing risk management. The deal opened possibilities for regional prosperity, including expanded Abraham Accords participation, yet required sustained diplomatic effort to translate into lasting stability. What happened next in the coming days would determine whether this marked a genuine inflection or another temporary plateau in a volatile landscape. Tactical visualization from recent imagery showed cleared lanes and adjusted patrols, creating conditions for increased traffic, but the psychological residue of prior attacks kept decision-makers cautious. Alliance tensions eased marginally as Gulf partners assessed opportunities for normalized ties with Israel, facilitated by shared defense experiences during Epic Fury. Yet proxy dynamics in Yemen and Lebanon introduced variables that could test the agreement's resilience quickly. The situation remains fluid, with developments sourced from open-source intelligence and official statements as of this date.